next round of our workshop. Welcome back to all of you, and I'm very glad now to introduce Carolina Vigura. She has already, of course, introduced herself in our opening round. I just want to say that for us, LibMod, and for me personally, this is one of the wonderful discoveries we made over the last 2 or 3 years, being in touch with Carolina, who is one of the most outstanding, I would say, both philosophical or scientific and political liberal voices in Poland and beyond. So she will open our next round of discussion, dealing with the question how to counter populist politics of emotions. Please, Carolina.
Thank you so much, Ralph. I am actually wondering how to speak after such an introduction. Thank you for your kind words, and I am always delighted to be a part of what Centrum Liberale Moderna is organizing. So I was reflecting on the first round and basically very much on what Thomas said at the very end of his intervention, namely the fact that there is still some enthusiasm about democracy, for example, in Belarus and in Hong Kong. And then I started to ask myself a question: how this is possible that the most enthusiastic proponents of democracy are in countries that are actually not democratic? So, for example, my own biography is very much marked by the Maidan in the Ukraine, and now, of course, we are observing Belarus. I'm actually speaking a little bit later today with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and also we reflect on Hong Kong, and this seems so paradoxical that once a country becomes democratic, the enthusiasm for democracy and for liberalism as such seems smaller, and how it is possible. Surely my own country is an example of that. So we have to ask a question: what do we actually need to revitalize enthusiasm in thinking about existing democracies, not democracies that we can achieve, not political systems that we can change? And I'm saying this because I do believe that something has changed profoundly in how we have been thinking about politics and history and the future within the past decades. Namely, look, in 1945 and after 1945, basically the past seemed to be the darkest time, and the future seemed to be the source of enthusiasm and hope. And isn't it that today we basically think that the past is basically what has happened and was right and was good, and the future is the source of anxiety and fear? And this is very important because when we look into classical philosophy of points of history where the politics has been changing profoundly. So when we look, for example, into Alexis de Tocqueville's works, then we will see that at those times, future and the past were seen very similarly. So, for example, it is Alexis de Tocqueville who writes about the dark depths of the future, not on the top of the past. And I'm saying this because I do believe that it's very important when you think about emotions and politics. And I was asked by Ralph and by Reinhard to answer the following question: how to counter populist politics of emotions? And the fact that it is the future and not the past which is causing fear, anxiety, powerlessness, uncertainty, I think this is the fact that we have to address here. And we should be more creative in finding answers to what is actually going on today. And we also need better diagnosis, because I do believe that defeating populism needs a clearer understanding of the reason or the reasons why populism is so popular today. So one of the way of looking for the answer is, of course, looking on emotions and how emotions are shaping our politics. And if I were just to make one small remark on the question, the initial question I was given to answer here, how to counter populist politics of emotions, I would just say that perhaps we should not ask such question suggesting that the emotions are the realm of populism, but rather we should think about emotions as a vital and important part of politics and ask how to revitalize liberal politics of emotions. Now, my main argument is that perhaps we should not depart from emotions, but rather try to work with those existing emotions, those that Ralph mentioned at the very beginning and that were repeated today during the discussion: fear, frustration, and basically the readiness of people to rationalize a lot about bad behavior from leaders, from populist leaders, just because they make the promise to make the future a little bit easier. And in order to explain what I have in mind when I say that we basically should not depart from emotions, but rather work with them in a liberal way, I will take you straight to the story. It is one of my favorite novels. It is actually French. It is a book about France, but it also could be about my country. It could be about any of your countries. It is called The Place, and it was written by a renowned French intellectual and writer, Annie Ernaux. The book starts with a scene of a funeral. So Annie Ernaux, who is always a heroine of her own books, approaches a coffin which is being presented during a funeral. Inside the coffin, there is the body of her father. And she says, the first word that comes to my mind today is guilt. Why guilt? She says, I will explain it now. And of course, as in Annie Ernaux's books, the exorcism of memory begins. And what she explains, what she is telling us, is a story about a girl, herself, of course, who was born in a peasant family in France, not a rich one, on the contrary, and who has ascended throughout the decades, educated, emigrated to Paris, etc., and became eventually a well-known intellectual writer, translator, etc. And what she says is actually this story of a success, of an individual success, is also a story of a profound loss. So she did gain a lot as an intellectual and writer, but she also lost, for example, she lost the common language with her family. She was unable to communicate with her father. And the loss was, of course, mutual, because he also lost the way they communicated as a father and child. He also lost his dreams to be an elderly person at the side of his daughter and her children, etc., etc. So as I said, this is a book which is about France, but it could also be about my country. It could also be about your country. Namely, this book is like a fabular version of a great quote from Raymond Aron, the great French liberal, who once said that success comes at a great cost. And my country, for example, is a great example of this. So after 1989, Poland has had a tremendous success economically, politically, and also from the point of view of international relations. But this success came at a great, tremendous cost. And when I'm saying about the cost, I'm not necessarily mean bankruptcies, unemployment, also, although they of course have been there. But what I also mean is a loss on a more existential level. So, for example, a loss of traditional sources of identity, loss of relationships, loss of social base of many, many people. So what I would like to say, and what I would like to make my main argument, is that a great change causes a great loss, and that success comes at a great cost. At the same time, it also has something global to it, because when you look at the other countries, when you look at the global aspect of the history of the past 30 years, you will see that the same story might have been told about countries like France, like the Netherlands, like the UK, like the US. Namely, the level on which we are all living, our longevity, the life expectations of small children, etc., they all soared. But at the same time, there is this ambivalent feeling of loss because of all those reasons I mentioned before: identity, relationships, social base, etc., etc. So I do not want to praise populists, but I wouldn't be myself if I didn't say that they were the most skillful in understanding, in grasping the feeling of loss. And because feeling of loss is so ambiguous, they have been translating the feeling of loss into other, more clear emotions. So, for example, they have been translating feeling of loss into fear of the refugees, into resentment towards the neighbors, but also some more positive feelings like defending your own family, defending your own community, etc., etc. And when I say this, I would like to stress very, very strongly that, in a way, when people ask me why the populists are so strong in my country, and they ask why they are so strong despite Poland's success, I answered, it is because of the Poland's success. And wherever populists are either at power or they are growing in popularity, it is actually a very similar story. So we start to understand that they do not buy their voters. Like in Poland, they were giving the 500 plus money for the families with children. But in fact, they didn't buy the voters. It is about creating a dream of a traditional community that we should be going back to, because the future is so dark. Now, how to respond to this? Liberals are basically not very eager to delve into emotions. They basically think about emotions in a very skeptical way, and they do have very good arguments to do so. So I do believe that the history of the 20th century is a very good reason to think about emotions in a very skeptical manner. Name it as examples, National Socialism in Germany, but also, for example, the war in former Yugoslavia, where emotions were manipulated to an extent they caused extreme atrocities. But then I'm also trained as a historian of ideas, and classical philosophy offers a completely different view of emotions that we often have today. Namely, from Thucydides through Hobbes and Montesquieu, you have a completely different approach to emotions. Namely, it is not that they're simply good emotions and bad emotions. For example, good emotions are love and friendship, and bad emotions are fear and, for example, resentment. Thomas Hobbes, for example, tells us very wisely that it's not that fear is bad itself for a political community, but rather there are various types of fear. So there are not bad and good emotions. There are only bad and good shades of emotions. For example, superstitious fear or fear of minorities is a kind of fear which is bad for political community. But for example, fear of the law, fear of the rule of law is not a bad fear at all for political community, of course. So my biggest argument is that we should not depart from emotions, not think that emotions are only a realm in which populists are simply very good. And that's why we should depart from emotions and be completely rational about what we're doing. But without neglecting rationality, of course, I would like to suggest that emotions are very important to regain our enthusiasm in liberalism. And look, by the way, at the following paradox. In the 20s and 30s, so in the times of various nationalisms and fascisms, which are very often compared to populism today. In those years, populists and in those years, fascists, nationalists were very passionate, but so were the opponents of fascists and nationalists. So I do believe it was Michael Walzer who once wrote, "It wouldn't be possible to oppose Hitler without passionate defense of democracy, freedom, and liberalism, and all the goods that are given by those ideologies." So the paradox is that today, I wouldn't say that the populists are very passionate. In fact, they are using a lot of emotions because this is the way they are offering their voters reassurance, identity, and also they meet the expectation of a contemporary social media follower by using a lot of emotions. But at the same time, the opponents of populists are afraid to delve into emotions, are forgetting about this classical heritage of thinking about emotions in philosophy, when in fact, the question is not about departing from emotions, it is rather about choosing wisely and working with emotions. So I do believe that we don't feel what we feel. Basically, we feel what we are told that we feel. This means that I would like to make a pledge for coming back to the feeling of loss or any other deep emotions that are there in the social structure, in the social realm. But then my argument is to work with those emotions and to translate those emotions into ones that are better for political community, for liberal political community. One of the examples, I can talk about it at length perhaps later if you have some questions, is empathy. We know from our culture that in our personal lives, when somebody is suffering loss, for example, loss of an individual, we react with empathy. It is empathy that gives us hope for the future, that makes eventually the future a little brighter, a little less dark. And last sentence, I know that I have to finish, Ralph, I'm very sorry, just one sentence I just wanted to say, that without being naive, I would like to stress that liberalism means belief in freedom of individual. And this demands trust in people. And this demands also optimism. So in order not to fall into defensiveness and defeatism, we have to remember one thing. The greatest successes of 1989, including the success of my own country, came from hope.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Lene von Bismarck already commented, fascinating talk. It reminds me a little bit on the very long line of the dialectics between liberal modernization and anti-liberal counter narratives, which had all the time being about these losses you had been describing, that this process of liberal modernization has been perceived by parts not only of the society of the common people, but also by very prominent intellectuals as a history of losses. Yeah, loss of national identity, loss of community, loss of solidarity. And I totally agree that this is one of the major challenges, to find liberal answers to those, let's say, needs and values around these patterns of community, solidarity, security, a certain degree of stability, also biographical stability in a very disruptive process of modernization. We tried to develop a program, the Center for Liberal Modernity, on security in times of fundamental and rapid change as a challenge to liberal democracies. So I would like to open up now to your question and comments. Who wants to? Christopher Gohl, raising my hand.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for bringing up this very important topic, which I think we've long neglected. We have a tendency to believe in reason, in legal measures and constitutions, but let's bring back emotions. And I wonder whether emotion is just the first step to really rediscover liberal morality. I think liberalism has been from the beginning a moral project also. And I encourage us to rediscover those roots and to rediscover the force of morality, really, of liberal morality, that is. We're often liberalism and all those finger-wagging people that never take it from morals to an argument. And of course, that critique we shall uphold. On the other hand, I think we do need to reconfigure a way in how to speak to moral sensibilities. I recently came across fascinating work by Jonathan Haidt about the righteous mind, and he has this proposes this liberal moral matrix about fairness and cheating, about liberty and oppression, about care and harm. And I think those are some of the gut feelings, I think, that we need to rediscover and term and frame our own policy with, or even our liberal project. So I wonder whether that's how the argument from emotions to morals, and rediscover. Basically, I think the tradition of liberalitas, right? Liberalitas was generousness, was a virtue back in ancient times that very much led up to the to our liberal argument today. As you can read, I recommend this wonderful book by Helena Rosenblatt on the forgotten history of liberalism.
Thank you very much. Goran.
Thanks. Yeah, great. Thanks. Carolina, you know, maybe you will be the best person to write the book that I really want to read, and that's the opposite direction of Hirschman's books, From Passions to Interests. I think your talk very much is inspiring to think of how liberals can get it back from the interest that has been at the forefront of their arguments to the passions again. I almost feel like we need a map rather than a history of political thought. You have my encouragement to do that. And a small commercial for those of you who have not read it, the compendium that Carolina made about Poland and and sort of the Polish case with 5 different essays of 5 different contributors is a really excellent case study on one country. I want to mention two things. One is that when we talk about this interest and the passions, I very much agree with you that it should be emotions. But also, when we look at what is the perception of liberal, my argument will be that very much will be shaped by the economic understanding of it, and actually will be looked through rather in most of Europe, both West and East, as a neoliberal in terms of economic policies, in terms of free market and so on, which probably is unfair on the entire liberal thought and the body of what it represents. But we have to take it as a kind of a starting point. And that's my first question. Is the brand damaged beyond repair? Meaning like, shall we look for a different brand and name? The second question is related to actually a problem that I also see not only in my work, I don't see it resolved, and that is the issue of identity, and in this case, identity of Europe and Europeans, including the national identity. And I'm speaking also about a benevolent, most of the time, but not always, structural racism that permeates a lot of Europe. So actually, when the populists and when the nationalists stroke these emotions, they're genuine in their hatred, irrespectively of how tired they are. But when the liberals say, "Oh, everything is, we are really about universalist values," a lot of people feel that half-heartedly. I mean, think of a Turk who has to decide whether she or he would have a German or a Turkish passport here. Think of the Ukrainians 5 to 10 years from now in Poland that migrated now. So the general universalist liberal proposition will be that you have a right to choose, while the reality on the ground is that actually you don't have a right to choose. You have to integrate. And that brings me to the second question. How we can avoid that this is not yet another educational project of liberals, simply because people are tired of being educated by liberals. And that ties in with my last, and I will finish with this point, which is as well the question, when you listen to Orban, when you listen to Kaczynski, they're not saying, I have the wisdom. They're saying, you have the wisdom and I'm your chosen mouthpiece. And that's a very communicationally advanced thing. While actually in the last 30 years, a lot of liberals have been exactly the opposite. They will say, actually, I have the knowledge, I have the PhD, I have this and then the diplomas that we talked earlier, and actually follow me and you will have a better life. How do we go in that direction? Sorry, too many questions, pick and choose, but I just want to throw them into the debate because this is really something that I see myself, my colleagues, and a lot of people struggling in the field as well.
Thanks a lot, Goran. Because this was the final provocation. The question is the liberal brand damaged beyond repair? So our basic assumption was reinventing or rethinking liberalism. At least there's a chance to revive it. But yeah, we have to very seriously look for kind of renovation of liberal, not only values, but politics. So next one, maybe we will go back then into our group here, Mahmoud Haidar.
Thank you. Very interesting points that were raised, not only in this previous one, but the two previous ones. And I'd like to make sort of a bridge, if you allow me, between what the previous two speakers spoke about, the professionalization of politics to the point of majorities losing to the NIMs, and the laziness that the previous also speaker spoke about, the end of history / laziness, this argument. And now with the last piece, it seems to me that what we're looking for is some form of an adversarial arena for liberalism to come forward again. If I contrast the following, we've become so technocratic instead of political, and probably more civil society rather than party system and ideologies. I mean, I know the connotation of ideology is not so famous anymore, but we had the passion of, fighting populism, as Carolina was saying. There was a passion on that side. It was pretty much the party system rather than, the loose civil society, the leaderless, and etc. The gilets jaunes, if you like. And the symbolic, the lack of the symbolic or the dreams, as my neighbor said a few minutes ago, instead of the values, now we're dealing with, with the beliefs, if you like. And the fuzzy beliefs are the ones that worry us most. I mean, the religious extremisms, the racisms, and etc. As if, again, we're not gonna get back into the arena and win a fight unless we find ourselves in an adversarial a polarization that works for liberalism. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this logic of sauve qui peut. Let's find the passport for the Turkish, as the previous fellow just mentioned, and I like that. So between that adversarial and the realities of today, the demographics, the environment, the technology, and these are serious, very serious challenges that liberalism seems to have somewhat, not at least engaged in a passionate fashion. My question is the following. Liberalism puts the individual at the center, but I suppose we seem to forget that we get there only after the social gets some sound way of living, some human rights, some rule of law. So the social is not to disappear from the picture. And that tension between the social and the individual has to come forward again. And it has to come forward at least in some healthy fashion. Because yes, the fears can be many, and some fears are good and some fears are bad, as Carolina said, and I totally agree. But the question is the following. Are we talking about emotions here or passions or tensions? We need a healthy tension, a healthy passion. We need to go back to even the intellectual gaining some tension and some passion, not only the emotions. And my question, if I may, to Carolina is, between the social and the individual, where would you put the cursor today so that we get into a new fight and hopefully win it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other? Clemens Schneider?
Yeah, in fact, one very, very important liberal thinker has assessed that we are mainly driven by emotions, which was David Hume, of course, who already wrote that 250 years ago, that man is mainly driven by passions and not by his rational entities. One of my absolutely favorite times in the history of liberalism is liberalism in 19th century Britain. And one of my favorite people there is Richard Cobden, who managed to get tens of thousands of workers to the street protesting in favor of free trade. And I think that is a wonderful example of somebody who actually emotionalized our beliefs and our convictions as liberals. And maybe one part of the problem, that's just, I'm throwing this into the room as food for thought, one part of the problem we have nowadays is that we lack one issue. Like if you look into the Fridays for Future movement, for example, they have this one issue. They have the thing with the environment and all that. We had women's rights issues back in the day. We had racial segregation issues. What is the 21st century issue of liberalism where we can actually pull on those emotions and emotionalize our convictions and make them manifest in a certain point?
Michael Zürn, and then we will return to Carolina for final remarks.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I just want to ask one question, and you used this figure that you cited Raymond Aron by saying any success breeds also a loss, and I just would like to relate this back to the talk of Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, and I'm just wondering a little bit whether this basic idea to say, well, the Polish success and the Polish modernization successes have created losses, and the losses are the loss of tradition. Whether that is not something that very much essentially brings up the teleological basic idea. Well, there's a process going on, a modernization process going on, but now there is some resistance and that will go over. It has always been so in history that progress produced some sort of backlash and some sort of losers. So, I mean, in a sense, if that is the way to read the current Polish situation, you would say, well, we are living in a period of transition where we have those sort of resistance, but in the end, we are on the right way. And I'm just asking this now in this provocative way, whether you would essentially see it the same way, and whether that does not contradict the sort of Kleine-Brockhoff statement, we should give up the Fukuyama teleology.
And maybe a final question, Carolina, from my side. Do you think we can categorize emotions, feelings, between and differentiate between, I would say, then emotions which are inherently anti-liberal, so creating a kind of tendency to authoritarianism and to xenophobia and kind of hostile political culture like fear. I think fear is really inherently anti-liberal, and hate, of course. And on the other hand, you mentioned hope, maybe a little bit more modest confidence in the future that we are able to shape the future in a better way. Confidence. Justice was one, I would say, was at the origin of liberalism. It was very much about justice. Of course, liberty and justice. Liberty and justice. Fairness, generosity. So, and how to transform these kinds of emotions into policy. Yeah, so I think this is for me, the challenge. Carolina.
Thank you so much, Ralph, and thank you everybody for those insightful questions. I will try to wrap it up in order to let the final speaker of the panel also have as much time as possible. Now, I will start with Ralph, and I will end with you, Ralph, if possible, because you also said some insightful comments at the very beginning. Namely, you have reflected at the beginning, just after I was speaking, on various types of loss. And I would just like to throw another egg in the basket, saying the time we are living today is also a time of profound change, and loss is an ongoing loss. Only two examples of that is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been already interpreted as a kind of grief. So loss of the way of living we have got used to is a part of this pandemic, including the fact that we are not all of us in Berlin today, which is something new in the life of the speaker, and which is caused by pandemic. But there are also much more graver differences in the way we live today to the way we lived only a couple of months ago. So this is one example of an ongoing loss. There is another ongoing loss, which is crucial for our existence. This is the climate change. When we are still reflecting on the loss of democratic transformation in Central and Eastern Europe, the people who are 20 plus today are reflecting on a quite different loss. And this is the loss of climate. This is the loss of natural environment. So we have to be aware of that. Now, as for the question of Helena regarding examples of positive use of empathy, I will just name two, although I do believe there are more. Look, for example, at the presidential campaign of Zuzana Čaputová in Slovakia. She openly, explicitly spoke about empathy many, many times in her campaign. And this contributed to creating her image as a politician, and also contributed to her success. Now in Poland, the same candidate that crushed once Law and Justice in my home city in Warsaw, namely Rafał Trzaskowski, he crushed his opponent in the local elections in 2018 in the first round. Now, well, he lost in the presidential race, but he is working anew with new energy. And what he is creating today is a social movement called New Solidarity. New Solidarity is a new interpretation of solidarity in Polish terms. It means, and also he concentrates a lot on the subject of empathy. So I'm sure there are positive examples of politicians that are already using the language of empathy in order to gain popularity. Just two examples for Helena. And now I very much like the remark of Christopher about liberal moralizing. I just wanted to add up one more question to it. So the answer will be a question. Isn't it that the liberal moralizing, this finger, is actually a kind of a work avoidance? So in order not to grasp the problem, liberals very often, and also in global context, not only in one or other country, they're using moralizing in order to basically stay where they are, and not to basically work, to do the work which is to be done. I will come back to that at the very end, reflecting also on the question of Ralph, because it touched the question of work and what is to be done actually in the most direct way. But now I would like to turn to Goran and your great three questions. You also asked me on the chat whether I read Hirschman's book on passions and interests. Yes, of course, it was one of the most important books in my intellectual biography. Although I must admit, after all those years, I would criticize Hirschman because he basically neglects the French tradition of thinking about emotions, and I do believe we shouldn't analyze emotions in global and international politics today without mentioning Pierre Asner, because this is the person who actually was capable of thinking about both emotions and interests and globalization. I do believe that we have to add up Pierre Asner here. But your first question was actually whether the brand is damaged without repair. I do believe that you meant liberal democracy. Yes, well, I do believe that democracy has been for many, many years, and perhaps for always, it has been a political system that was so successful because it was capable of internal reform. And I don't think that democracy has lost this capability of reforming itself. I do believe that we are going through a time of crisis, and perhaps the worst that can happen is that we become so impatient. When I have been observing the liberal discussions in the US and in Poland in the past few years, I have been struck with the fact of lack of patience. Like, many people didn't recognize from the very beginning that what we are experiencing today is not an episode, but it is a structurally created or structurally caused development of our policies. Without understanding this, and only with moralizing and thinking that this is just an episode, it will pass. And without understanding that the populists are actually the result of the crisis and not the reason for crisis, I think we will not be able to repair liberal democracy. But still, being a liberal, I am still an optimist. So I believe that the capability of doing so is still there. Now, the question number 2 is how can we avoid education? This is a great question, because we have seen many educational projects in liberalism in the past decades that basically are not listened to anymore. I mentioned Habermas previously, but I would also say similar things about Martha Nussbaum, for example, and her educational approach to liberalism, with a slightly utopian argument that the societies can simply be educated, they simply be changed. So, for example, the racist attitudes can simply be outed, departed from. Well, here I come back again to classical philosophy and what it tells us about changing societies. Changing societies with understanding of emotions is more about humble understanding that the passions are extremely strong forces that are shaping our reality, and the only thing that can be done by liberal political leaders is translating those passions and working with them, but not with this educational approach that will change them completely. So
unfortunately, we have to close this session.
I understand this very much, very well. I'm very sorry. The questions were just wonderful. And I would try perhaps to write a few words in the chat so that I don't take any more time. But there were 3 more questions, so I'll just try to address them in the chat.
Thank you so much, Carolina.
It was
a fascinating round. I'm already thinking about possible continuation. Okay, but we have to look at the end of the day how we will continue this kind of conversation. For sure, we will do it next year. This should not be a one-shot event. So the next one will be Amichai Magen, our next speaker. Talking before the backdrop of the Israeli experience, and for me also personally, I have certain also emotional relation with the country, also personally. This is a very sad and interesting experience, how Israel is turning from a, I would say, contradictory liberal democracy experiment to a more nationalistic and anti-liberal direction. And the question to Amit Shai is if the desire for security, which of course for at least Jewish Israelis is of overarching importance, is dominating the desire for liberty. Amit Shai, please.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Fear is a great enemy of liberalism, but so is hunger for food. And so I know I'm standing between you and lunch, and so I'll try to keep things brief. Ralph, with your permission, I'd like to address the security liberalism dilemma in a slightly different prism. I'd like to talk a little bit about the genealogy of liberalism, because I think this is so pertinent to us. And in this context, the Israeli experience is certainly relevant and significant. It certainly is relevant and significant to me, but I don't think it's terribly unusual. And I think it will be more profitable to talk about the security-liberty dilemma in somewhat more general terms. If there are specific questions about Israel, I'd be happy to answer them, but I don't think it's that important. Let me start with this. Liberalism is the search for a society in which people need not be afraid. Freedom from fear is the most basic freedom. And if we are afraid, we are not free, and we cannot have liberal societies. These insights are found in Montesquieu, but also Judith Shklar's notion of the liberalism of fear, and are really the foundation of modern liberalism. Now, what liberals have feared has changed over time. The historical development of liberalism is primarily the result of four historical layered fears which have had particular resonance. And I'm talking about the modern era. These four fears are, firstly, the fear of religious fanaticism in the 17th century, then the fear of revolution and reaction in the 18th century, fear from poverty in the middle to late 19th century, and most recently, the fear of totalitarianism in the middle of the 20th century. And these four fears have essentially given us different species of liberalism, from the proto-liberalism of Thomas Hobbes to classical liberalism, to social liberalism, and then most recently to neoliberalism or to liberal internationalism. Point number one. Point number two, contemporary liberal order is really the result of a series of contestations in which liberal solutions competed and emerged victorious out of these contestations. I think this is very, very important for us to understand, and I will elaborate this in a moment. But what I mean by this is that religious toleration essentially defeated religious fanaticism. It was the Dutch Republic and post-Glorious Revolution English experience that proved that religious toleration was a superior social, political, economic system to a system of religious intolerance. Constitutional and republican government, with its limited government, the rule of law, civil and political rights, defeated absolutism in the 18th and early 19th century. The market-based welfare state defeated a sort of a pure laissez-faire system where poverty was allowed to run rampant, and most recently, liberal democracy and liberal internationalism defeated totalitarianism. And I think that genealogy teaches us a very, very important lesson. To survive and thrive in the 21st century, liberalism must not only learn how to contest again, it must learn how to defeat illiberal and anti-liberal competitors. We absolutely need to avoid the assumption that somehow liberal orders are inherently superior. I think this is a dangerous determinism. So the arc of the moral universe does not bend towards justice on its own volition. If we do not learn how to contest again and to be victorious again with liberal solutions, there is no guarantee that we will defeat illiberal and anti-liberal contesters. So successful liberal contestation will depend on three things: superior ideas, superior institutions, and political functionality, especially the political functionality of the most important liberal democratic states, primarily the United States, but also Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere. And finally, superior technological, economic, and military power. Okay? It's not just about ideas, it's also about the functionality of our political institutions, and it's also about superior technological, economic, and ultimately coercive power. What are we afraid of today? What is the central challenge for liberalism today? I would like to suggest that today we face a new fear, which I will summarize in terms of the fear of human redundancy. We are fundamentally fearful of human redundancy, and that fear takes a number of different forms. We are afraid of becoming redundant as citizens. We have become consumers of rights rather than active citizens, something that Hannah Arendt has repeatedly warned us against. We are fear of losing our agency and our ability to control our private spheres, our privacy, our agency as economic actors. We are afraid of environmental redundancy, or more broadly, redundancy as a result of some kind of catastrophic risk, whether it's nuclear war or unaligned artificial intelligence or an environmental catastrophe. We are increasingly afraid of technological redundancy, where most people will become economically redundant because ordinary people are afraid to become economically and in some respects militarily useless and therefore lacking in political utility. And in a deep sense, we are facing a crisis of epistemic security. I think ordinary people today, and we see this in the flowering of conspiracy theories, ordinary people today increasingly feel that they are inadequate to deal with the complexity and the pace of informational change. And they are increasingly living in an environment of what I will call epistemic insecurity, where they simply are unable to figure out what is truth and what is false. And this is, of course, driven by deep fake technologies, and this is a challenge that we are facing more and more. So the key challenge for liberalism in the 21st century, or at least in today and in the coming decades, is how to overcome the reasonable and legitimate human fear of redundancy, and to do it in a matter that is demonstrably superior to anti-liberal or illiberal alternative. Essentially, what we need is a new species of liberal humanism that addresses the fundamental insecurity that comes out of a sense of human redundancy. Now, I have some ideas about avenues that we can go down to try to address this fear of growing human redundancy. I don't know how we're doing for time, but I'm also happy to stop here and open this up to conversation. Or Ralph, if you would like, I will articulate some ideas for where we go forward with this.
I would suggest that you will do it in responding some short comments and answers to your introduction. Thank you very much, Dan Amichai. Please.
Thank you so much. Fascinating analysis, because we usually accuse our opponents about pondering fear and getting electoral votes that way. So if liberalism is actually built on fear, even if it's fear from bad things, I think that's a rather new kind of analysis. So thank you so much for sharing it. My worry is, though, that fear is an incredibly negative emotion.
Yeah.
And you have mentioned the United States as kind of the bastion of the liberal free word. And I think you were right. It has been for a pretty long time, with not just the last couple of years of Trump administration, but in general, the last 10, 15 years of US leadership on this front is incredibly worrying. So by using the American example and the upcoming elections, if you're a Republican voter, you're tremendously fearful of the Democrats and of the riots and left-wing anti-fascists taking over the country, taking away your gun rights and taxing you like it was common in during socialism. I don't think that the fear is necessarily justified, but it's definitely there. And if you're a Democratic voter, it's the exact opposite. You're incredibly fearful what's going to happen during a second Trump administration. There might be a third or fourth. And you're incredibly fearful what's going on with women's rights, with gay rights, and with a lot of the social liberalism that we fought for. So how do you actually mitigate such a strong feeling, even in such a well-established democracy, liberal democracy like the United States? And aren't you worried if we really build a lot of our narratives around fear and the discussion around such a deep emotion that we're going to end up with very, very unpredictable outcomes?
Thanks a lot. Other questions or comments? Then I would ask a question to, Wolfgang Merkel, please.
I would like to come back to the question of fear and liberalism. Amichai argued there is an increasing number of people who cannot accept scientific truth. We should think about the following. What we can acknowledge, especially in the complex crises of climate change and now of the pandemic crisis, that science plays a much bigger role than it has played 20 years ago. It delivers expertise to politicians who do not have a clue how the virus works and how to calculate global warming. So, and if we look to the pandemic crisis, one could certainly sharply formulated, could argue that there is a governance by fear, by rational fear created by science. And this is, so to say, the other side. I don't argue that this is not scientific truth, but science threatens to suspend to some extent the liberal idea of democratic representation. Why do we need representation if we already know the result, the truth created by science? This is the first. I have a second point. We did not mention so far that freedom has at least two dimensions, as Isaiah Berlin learned us, and to some extent Amartya Sen taught us as well. This is not only the classical freedom from something, but it's also the positive freedom for doing something, therefore to develop capabilities and so forth, to live a free life. And I think both topics, the one of positive freedom should be acknowledged somehow more in the discussion. And the first point, that science may rush into a problematic role in governance.
Yeah, I would like to touch upon Wolfgang Merkel's remarks and continue them a little bit. If we differentiate between negative and positive freedom, I would say the traditional answer to secure the negative freedom was the traditional liberal answer, the rule of law, the balance of powers, a basic concept of citizens' rights, protecting the individual from political power and economic powers. And I would agree that now it's, of course, this is still relevant, especially if we, in authoritarian countries or semi-authoritarian countries, but in established liberal democracies, it's much more about positive freedoms and how to increase and how to secure positive freedom. I think one traditional answer had been the welfare state, providing kind of basic social security, so diminishing the fear of social degradation and misery, and this is still highly relevant. But another answer was then education in terms of empowering people to keep pace with technological change, to enable them to make use of their economic opportunities, to create equal opportunities. So I still think that education is a key part of the answers, and actually lifelong learning has become a key tool to enable people to respond to disruptive change in the economic and professional life. And as Amit Shah mentioned, technology also was an answer against fear, to find technological solutions from medical progress, medicaments. Now, if you call it about Corona, it's very much, of course, finding was an Impfstoff, vaccines. Yeah, it's very much about finding vaccines. So and climate change, we will come to back to that a little bit later. Of course, is also very much about finding technological solutions. So I would be interested, how would you weigh these different components, or do you see any new elements we would need to not maybe to overcome fear, but to make sure that fear is not dominating our societies?
Yeah, just very briefly. What I want to suggest, and of course I was very limited for time, so Wolfgang is correct. I focused on the negative freedom rather than the positive, and of course liberalism also has a positive freedom message. But let's start with fundamentals. liberal orders in terms of ideas and institutions represent solution structures to the main fear of their era, whether it's religious intolerance or absolutism or poverty. So I think it's very important at this historical juncture that we ask, what are the most fundamental fears and reasonable fears? I'm not talking about paranoia here. I'm talking about reasonable fears of ordinary people in the 21st century. And I think we can map those fears. It is the fear of economic redundancy. It is the fear of technological redundancy. In some respects, very soon, it may also become the fear of biological redundancy, given the environmental issues that we are facing, but also bioengineering. So we need to confront that, and we need to think of liberalism as a solution structure to the most fundamental fears of the day. Because, as you have said correctly, Ralph, fear is the enemy of liberalism. And illiberalism and anti-liberalism thrives in an atmosphere of terror and fear. And here I think we need a degree of modesty that I find in Judith Shklar's concept of the liberalism of fear. Judith Shklar was not encouraging or promoting the idea that fear should be the basis for liberalism. It's the opposite. What she was saying is that fundamentally the purpose of liberal ideas and liberal institutions is to shield people from cruelty, from the worst that the world can expose them to. Now, she was primarily thinking about totalitarian government. But in the 21st century, we are facing a series of fears, which I think about in terms of this idea of human redundancy. The sources of this, some of them are anthropogenic, and some of the sources are not anthropogenic, like the pandemic or the other kind of natural causes of fear. So I think that if we want to make progress, and I think this very much dovetails with also what Carolina was saying, talking about emotions, we need to think about the future evolution of liberalism as providing a solution structure for the most important fears of the era, and to address those. Now, how do we do it? It's a combination of ideas, institutions, and power. And we haven't really discussed that, but I think these are the three elements that we need to address. To Wolfgang's question, yes, of course, there is a positive freedom element to liberalism, and that is the idea of human dignity. And a good liberal order is one that allows people to maximize their individual human flourishing and capability and potential. This would be my kind of idealized goal for what kind of liberal society we want to construct in the positive sense. With regards to science, my short and rather inadequate answer would be yes, that science can tell you how to do something, not what to do. You still need the moral discussion, the normative discussion, the political discussion in a world of competing interest, in a world of finite resources. You still need the democratic, deliberative aspects of the body politique in order to come up with an answer to the question, what should we do? Where should we invest our resources and our attention? So science can tell you how to do something or how to avoid something, but it cannot give you advice, moral advice, normative advice about how we should conduct our societies. For this, we need a vibrant, functional political systems. which, by the way, are being fundamentally undermined. Not so much in Germany, but if you look at the discussion in the United States, if you look at the discussion in Israel today, the great fear is of growing dysfunctionality as a result of epistemic insecurity, as a result of polarization and tribalization, that simply does not allow our political systems to even begin to address the major challenges that we face, whether it's climate or dealing with the pandemic. I think Germany here is in a relatively good situation, but we have more and more democracies around the world where it looks as if the software of the political system itself has been deeply infected and is dysfunctional. And unless we deal with this, particularly in the United States, unless America is able to bring the lights back on domestically, we will not be able to generate the functionality and the power that will allow us to revive some form of liberal order. So this is something that we need to pay great attention to.
Thank you very much, Amichai. Unfortunately, we have to stop here. With respect to then our lunch break here, and to allow you, those who are online with us, to have a break too. We will continue some key elements of this discussion in the next round, when we will come to climate change and liberal answers to climate change, the role of science, the functionality of liberal democracies, the role of technology. So there will be a continuation and not just a disruption now. Thank you very much for this extremely lively and interesting session we had this morning. I hope you will share our discussion in the afternoon too. Will accompany us. So thanks a lot, and we see each other and listen to each other. Should we say at 1:40, or what do you think? 1:40 p.m. Yeah? So thank you very much, and see you later.